Welcome to Peoples and Things, a podcast about human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel, an assistant professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. Today, my guest is Andrew Jewett, a historian, and we'll be talking about his new book, Science Under Fire, Challenges to Scientific Authority in Modern America, as well as some of his earlier work probably along the way. So, Andy, thanks so much for coming on to talk to me today.
Thanks for having me.
Science Under Fire is a really deep book about how people in the U.S. have become skeptical about scientific authority since the early 20th century. Mm-hmm. So how did you come to write this book?
Well, I started graduate school during the science wars of the 1990s when there was, all sorts of polemics on many different sides about the meaning of science in our culture. And really struck me at the time that both of the sides in those conflicts, which had a lot to do with whether science was socially constructed and what that meant about our society, were taking for granted certain kinds of assumptions about the meaning of science and about its relation to our culture. One being that science was this kind of rigidly, rigorously value-neutral form of knowledge, and then the other that it served as a kind of cultural keynote to the modern world, in a sense, right? That in some way that all of the things we see around us kind of hang on science in some sense. And I was skeptical in certain ways about both of those assumptions. And so I've written now 2 books that sort of interrogate those and try to sort of get a more complicated picture of how folks have thought about science, mainly in the 20th century United States. And the first book, as you know, focuses more on this sort of assertion of value neutrality. And this newer book is more about these claims about science being the source of our culture, in a sense, right? And so what I'm tracking really is the history of the idea that we live in a scientific culture, particularly in the United States, but sort of in the modern world generally. Sometimes this is associated with the concept of modernity, sometimes it's not. But I argued that in the 1920s, there's a shift from, some folks arguing that science would be a dangerous cultural guide to arguing that it is in fact setting the tone for our daily lives. It has determined how we think about ourselves and others. And so it's this intersection of science and conceptions of human behavior that interests me the most.
Mm-hmm. I thought it might be help listeners to have a really concrete example of the kinds of debates that pop up. So, right. You talked about the science wars. That's one place we could go. But in your conclusion, you discuss a graduation speech that the writer and editor Leon Wieseltier gave at Brandeis in 2013. And he said, among other things, that society had come to be dominated by instrumental reason, including the twin imperialisms of science and technology.
Right.
And then the psychologist Steven Pinker replied that, only through science could we come to know ourselves and all these things. So you want to say a bit about that case and how you see it kind of pulling out some of the themes of your book?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a case where Wieseltier presents, he says, you humanities students are the resistance, right? In some way dividing the world up into these sort of disciplinary terms, in a sense. And I think that's a very characteristic kind of argument that comes out of the 20th century. Has a lot to do with struggles around how education is going to be oriented, how professional authority is going to be divided up. And those are characteristically broad, sweeping kinds of claims. There have been other versions of this sort of critique that have been more specific and more particular. But this is actually the style that's most common in the middle of the 20th century. These sort of and to some extent becomes increasingly common again in the era of the science wars. We get these bigger and bigger kinds of histories of the modern world that are predicated on the assertion that certain sources of authority have sort of come to dominate. So this is very much continuous with what you see in the 1950s, for example. I suggest that there's a kind of national reckoning with the cultural meanings of science in the wake of World War II. We see it as a golden age of American science with the nuclear physicists and so forth and all the scientists in the advertisements. But there's a tremendous undercurrent of anxiety, too, about what science is doing to our self-understanding. And you see that very much coming out in this tussle between Wieseltier and Pinker, saying that we must follow this sort of style of intellectual work in order to be able to sustain human relations, really. And otherwise, the social order, our world as we know it, will fall apart.
Yeah. And you see counterparts to the Pinker response. I mean, if anything, Pinker's doubled down and tripled down on this argument since then,
Of course,
right?
yeah, over the years. Yeah, and that's not something I track with any consistency through the book, except insofar as I suggest that some of the most extravagant claims on behalf of scientific authority have been fodder for the critics. So I talk extent about B.F. Skinner, for example, in his novel Walden 2, and then some of his subsequent debates with Carl Rogers and people like that. But just like John Dewey in an earlier age, Skinner becomes this kind of perceived avatar of a scientific culture. I mean, if you look at him on the sort of spectrum of what scientific thinkers believe about the world, he's fairly extreme. But that comes to be taken as the kind of deep inner meaning of what a scientific culture would look like. Is this world beyond freedom and dignity, as he later titles a book, right? A world in which there really is no free will, everything is conditioned, and so there's this Brave New World is another kind of hit point. Aldous Huxley's earlier novel is constantly under discussion in the post-war period, as it is again today. But these become these sort of nightmare visions of what a scientific culture might look like if it's sort of taken to its fullest. And so, again, I'm not tracking the arguments on the sort of Pinker side as much, but they do come into the story on occasion as grist for this kind of mill. Yeah.
I was struck, I think the first chapter on like the 20s and the early part of the 20th century, there's a lot of optimism there that kind of, right? And I just wonder, where do you think that optimism came? And John Dewey is an important character in the story, I think is a nice kind of symbol of that optimism of that time.
I discuss in that chapter in the 20s a number of versions of what I call a program of mental modernization. And that's just, riffing on the concept of modernity itself. But a number of kinds of cultural programs that, again, as with Skinner after World War II, in the 20s, these were the kinds of nightmare visions that people seized upon and as thinking about what a scientific culture was going to look like. And there are a number of different versions. There's one associated with Bertrand Russell that has to do with a kind of existential, and in a sense, kind of understanding of the universe as sort of impervious to human meanings, that we have free will, we can act as we choose, but that there's no cosmic support for any of our values whatsoever. And so Bertrand Russell, as also a notorious atheist, is, one of these sort of flashpoints around which this controversy revolves. I talk about John B. Watson's behaviorism and his, at least operational denial of concepts like soul and mind, and again, this assertion of conditioning as the source of human behavior. I talk about how many folks saw parallels between Watson and Freud. There's, of course, a huge vogue of Freudianism. It's not clear how deep necessarily, but it's sort of all over the place in 1920s popular culture. And again, often seen by critics as this reduces our supposedly rational and moral behavior to some kind of, subterranean instinct, some sort of quasi-material force, or something like that. And then there's Dewey, and I point out there that Dewey's program is specifically designed to attack what he sees as weaknesses in these other cultural renderings of what science means. He's specifically insisting on the, not only the reality of free will, but the reality of human purposes, the reality of values as guides to action, all of these things embedding them in the natural world. But because of that naturalistic bent, because he says there is no supernatural realm, critics are constantly sort of collapsing his theory into these others, suggesting that he too is saying we're just mere machines or animals. And of course he is a kind of arch secularist in his day, and arguably a liberal Protestant in other ways, or a humanist. And his influence on education is an important part of structuring those views of him as this great cultural danger. But there's a tremendous amount of optimism behind all of these programs in the 1920s. And the critics on the other side, who are the main focus of the book, come in and say, well, this this shows us that a scientific culture has emerged, right? That
Right.
they start drawing lines between the writings of a Freud or a Watson or a Dewey or a Russell, to changes in education, to changes in consumption patterns, the sort of rise of sort of middle-class consumerism, suburbanization, the kind of keeping up with the Joneses mentality. They sort of draw some lines there and say that this is the result of a scientific way of thinking about ourselves and others, about human behavior.
Mm-hmm. I think the middle chapters of your book just do such a wonderful job showing how the critique of science comes from all these different constituencies, right?
Yeah, yep.
And these kind of different groups rise up to criticize science for often like different and maybe even incompatible reasons for
Absolutely,
a lot of times,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So what are some of the groups that you see as really important in this story, and what flaws did they see in scientific culture?
Yeah, I argue there that you can really find this kind of critique in the middle decades of the 20th century coming from just about everywhere. If you imagine a political spectrum, if you imagine a theological spectrum, you can find people with just about every set of commitments making an argument like this. And they often sound remarkably similar, as you can see from reading through the book, because they operate at such a high level of generality, saying that, science has sort of destroyed our conventional self-understanding. It's a kind of a sort of Jeremiad in a sense, right? As there was a moment before when we really understood ourselves, or there was a very long era, but going back in history, when we really understood ourselves, and now science has come in and sort of ruined that self-understanding, and we need to go back to before. And then there are just a whole bunch of different programs slotted in as to what came before, right? What was it that sustained our view of ourselves as moral actors, as having free will? These are some of the biggest themes in the middle of the 20th century, as not just material to be manipulated by totalitarians or by social engineers, right? And so you see that among religious leaders of all different kinds. And I'm specifically trying to sort of broaden the horizon beyond the sort of usual circle of conservative evangelicals, fundamentalists, Pentecostals, and so forth. And to try to say, you see this throughout the kind of liberal Protestant establishment. You see it among, capital C, conservative Jews, Jewish leaders. You see it among many Catholic leaders. You see it among people we consider religious modernists. Even back in the 1920s, a religious modernist like Shaler Matthews is criticizing this kind of scientific view of the world. Yeah. So religious leaders of all stripes. I talk about professional sort of academic humanities scholars of many different kinds, a little more divided, but you see a lot of folks arguing that the humanities are what upholds our sort of traditional understanding of the human person as a moral actor. Political conservatives, I spend a good deal of time on all of the different varieties of conservatism that constitute the new right in the 1950s, as folks like William F. Buckley and Russell Kirk are sort of rehabilitating conservatism. This strand of criticism of the modern social sciences and social engineering gets wrapped up with the New Deal in the minds of virtually all different kinds of conservatives, and is an important part of the glue that sort of holds the burgeoning conservative movement together, alongside anti-communism and this sort of more conventionally political critique of the New Deal. I talk about mainstream liberals. I talk about sort of dissidents within the social sciences themselves, who often start to resist the label social science and want to call themselves a kind of humanists, like the anthropologist Alfred Kroeber is one who says, I'm not a social scientist, right? Or later on, someone like a C. Wright Mills, a kind of conduit for these arguments into the New Left, saying that there's sort of disavowing the idea that there should be a kind of social, or there could be a kind of social science. You see it among certain kinds of political radicals. This is more a later story, and then so far as it's more the activists and counterculturalists of the 60s who tend to reject the kind of science-oriented modes of progressivism and radicalism. But you see it among someone like a Dwight MacDonald in the late 40s and early 1950s, arguing that the kind of scientific bent of modern thought has ruined radicalism too. So you see the place.
Yeah, I thought you did a nice job with identity too, of bringing in black leaders and feminists. So, like, what if we look to black leaders, for instance, what kind of critiques do you see?
Yeah, I mean, I suggest at the beginning that this is in some ways a more dominant theme among white thinkers than it is among folks in other groups, partly because some of the struggle for Black Americans, for example, is to just try to get into the mainstream, right? Is to try to get access to this growing authority of science in various ways, partly just by gaining jobs in the scientific community, partly by drawing on it as well. There's, of course, a strong undercurrent in the Black churches of, a kind of critique of secularism and a critique of scientific materialism. There's skepticism around certain kinds of policies, and you can see this coming out again today. And, the part of the story is that people in the Black community are not getting vaccines as often, but there's also more hesitancy there than you see elsewhere. And there's obviously a very, very long history of experimentation in medicine that's, very front and center in the minds of many people. The abuse of evolutionary rhetoric to talk about higher and lower races is on the minds of a lot of Black leaders. So that's one way in which it comes in. So, there's a sense in which it is first and foremost a kind of mainstream white story, right? I'm looking at the kind of post-war establishment and its various sort of dimensions, and suggesting, well, that there's an enormous amount of this kind of criticism there as well. Now, later on, this becomes a much more complex story by the 1970s, right? Because virtually all of the critiques, like maybe MacDonald and a few others, before the 1960s are saying, well, science has destroyed our traditional self-understanding. By the time you get into the late 60s and 70s, you get various sorts of marginalized groups saying, well, science is actually upholding traditional views, racist views, patriarchal views, right, that actually need to be changed. So what's pseudoscientific is actually the conventional understanding of human behavior, and that's what science has sort of imprinted on our culture, is something old and bad that we need to get rid of. So the critique, it's kind of flipped around in a sense, but it's still predicated on this sense that science is dictating how we think about ourselves.
Yeah. Story is about science, but it's also very much about the role of technology in our culture.
Yeah,
and I think
that's a very strong
theme. In part because people saw it, technology as applied science. I think.
Sure.
But there's lots of worries about technological change throughout the book. So how did you see kind of technology coming out in this story? Like, where do you think that comes from? When?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things you see throughout these arguments is a kind of lumping tendency to sort of stick things together, right? So it's why people jump back and forth between what we would consider scientific phenomena and technological phenomena, right? The concept of the machine is a metaphor, a big metaphor in the 1920s, both for those who are enthusiastic about social changes and those who are concerned about them. But the machine is a kind of symbol for both actual machines, but also mechanistic ways of thinking about human persons, right? And so you constantly get, even in the index, some categories for people as machines, things like that, right? You see this style of criticism over and over again, that we've been reduced to animals, we've been reduced to machines. And there, many of these critiques are not particularly systematic. Yeah. And so there's an enormous amount of kind of muddling and confusion about the actual means by which science or technology is causing cultural change, but you do see them routinely associated with one another. Technology becomes a more prominent theme again, I think, in the 1960s with the left critique, although it has a presence earlier on. Obviously the nuclear bomb is looming over a lot of this conversation in the late 40s and 50s, although surprisingly often the argument is that, well, the bomb isn't the problem. The problem is our self-understanding that leads us to use the bomb or have developed the bomb or not be able to handle the bomb. That the real problem is our sort of moral self-destruction. So technology comes in constantly throughout the book. And I don't sort of sit down and differentiate those critiques, I would say, all that much, but I do suggest in the introduction, and this is one of the main features of this discourse, is a constant conflation of science with technology. in terms of how they shape our lives. Sometimes you'll see a critic who suggests that technology is the main vector through which a kind of mechanistic view has shaped us, and you see that sometimes in the 20s, you see it sometimes in the 70s or beyond. Usually they're conflated in the middle decades of the 20th century.
Like 5 or 6 years ago, I taught a course on like the history of technology, criticisms of technology in industry.
Yeah.
And I really started that course with like romantic poets, actually, where you see a lot of this stuff.
Yep.
I mean, do you think that this critique of science goes back to kind of older romantic traditions? Do you see that thread playing out?
I think it does. I mean, I think there's obviously history and European thought for all of these sorts of arguments, both in the kind of romantic vein and in a kind of harsher anti-modern, sort of anti-liberal vein, moving toward the later 19th century and into the 20th. I think in some ways the wheel is reinvented in the United States. I mean, these people are not always consciously drawing on a Coleridge or something like that.
Yeah.
But they are often defending, certain kinds, similar sorts of alternatives in terms of structures of cultural authority to some of those earlier folks. I mean, by European standards, the critiques in this country are fairly moderate. Not a lot of people rejecting democracy, not a lot of people rejecting industry as such. You start to get some of that in the 60s and 70s. Typically, the assumption is that some new or some refurbished, I'd say, way of thinking is just going to solve the problem, right? If we just listen to the poets, or if we just listen to the novelists, or if we just listen to the ministers, or that's more or less the extent of the problem. Is that and that's partly why it's such a kind of mainstream and in fact kind of almost professional discourse. Is that it is. The stakes are in some ways the highest for those who represent some of these other sources of authority, who are, professional humanities scholars speaking for novelists, or political theorists, for example, a huge presence in this conversation, who's, are voicing these older traditions of thinking that they believe are going to, essentially solve the problem by sort of rehabilitating an older sense of human behavior or installing a new one later in the 20th century.
I think a really important lesson of the book is that this critique, as you've already said, it comes from both the left and the right.
Absolutely.
So why do you think it's such a bipartisan phenomenon? And I guess as a follow-up question, like, do the liberals and conservatives differ in the critiques they make, or is there a lot of similarity there?
There's a lot of similarity up through the 1960s, I would say. In that, the critiques remain at this very, very high level of generality. They're very rarely attached to specific political programs, except by this new right, which has a kind of oppositional vision, and a few politicians that it's rallying around, like Robert Taft and folks like that. But even there, it's a very, very broad kind of critique. And, on the other side, it's remarkable how many supporters of something like the welfare state are still extremely critical of the what we would think of as some of the assumptions on which it's based. That social sciences can know something about the human person. I mean, these aren't reasons why we ended up getting these policies during the New Deal, but they are widely seen in U.S. political culture as bearing some relation to the authority of the social sciences. So there's actually remarkable similarities between the arguments of, folks quite far over on the right and an establishment figure like a Reinhold Niebuhr, or, the historian Jacques Barzun in the middle of the 20th century, or someone quite far over to the left like Dwight MacDonald. Now, they tend to take on much more politically specific forms by the 60s and 70s, when they're much more closely tied to electoral politics, more closely tied to certain kinds of single-issue social movements about the placement of nuclear facilities, for example. Let's sort of get a little closer to the ground during that period, although much broader versions emerge again around kind of post-structuralist thought and sort of the late 20th century critiques of modernity. But so, one of the points of the book and one of the reasons why I originally conceived of writing it was how similar the critique often ends up looking across huge swaths of terrain politically, religiously. If you think of it in its simplest form as, science has shaped our culture, science has sort of ruined our self-understanding, we need to recover or replace it with X, right? You can fill in that X with so many different things.
Right. I thought you did a really nice job dealing with this kind of mirroring of the right and left from the 70s on, too. Because I think that's such including in our social circles, that's such a fraught issue.
It is,
I don't know if you saw, last year, I think it was last year, that Philip Murawski, the kind of historian of economic thought, had this essay where he was talking about science and technology studies and its kind of doubts about democracy and expertise, and linking it to kind of neoliberal conservative thinking, and trying to show that they're kind of like twins in a way, that they have deep interconnections. And that, of course, created a lot of defensiveness within the SDS community.
Of course.
But I thought you did a really nice kind of job showing that there are similarities, but it doesn't mean like they're coming from the same political place necessarily.
No, not at all. Not that they're in some ways reducible to one another, but that they're fungible, right? That they can be picked up and used for a lot of different kinds of purposes. And that was one of the main reasons I initially took up this study. I was originally planning to organize it around groups of political critics of kind of establishment liberalism, sort of welfare state liberalism.
Yeah.
And show that basically each group in turn, as they develop over the decades, right, the new right, the new left, communitarians, right, and on, each group has more or less picked up this kind of critique of the social sciences as the basis for a kind of political organization, right? And seeing how this has circulated and been modified over and over again to all of these different purposes still remains a sort of important task of the book, I would say, is that showing this is a line of continuity, for example. There are many others, but this is an important one I think we haven't explored as much between someone like Reinhold Niebuhr in the middle of the 20th century and the New Left, who, were ferociously critical of most things that he stood for. That generation inherited a certain set of assumptions about what science was and what science was doing, that they turned to very different purposes, but the language often sounds remarkably similar.
Yeah, I also thought you did a nice job of kind of showing... part of it's the new right, like the Crystal types, the people who start off as Democrats.
Irving Kristol,
and make the switch to a kind of conservatism during the 60s and earlier. And you even have like Daniel Patrick Moynihan making a similar kind of trajectory as a Democrat, having like real doubts about the Great Society and social engineering through welfare policies. But then you have the hippies at the same moment, kind of also having real doubts about the authority of the state.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
Is it a coincidence that this is both happening at the same time amongst kind of different left-right political groups, or do you really think there's just something broader in the air at that time?
No, I don't think it's entirely coincidence. I think there are a number of different factors there. One of the things I try to draw out in the book, and I don't want to make the argument too reductive, but it is, frequently the case that you can find the folks making this argument have a professional investment in some alternative structure of cultural authority, right? And so there are, real important factors that have to do with just professional interests here, the interests of a humanities scholar, not always, but often. And so that's one dimension, is that there are a lot of folks who have investments at any given time and other ways of thinking professionally. I think another is that there is a kind of crisis of the American welfare state in the 1960s, right? There's a series of arguments about the Great Society, especially as Johnson is trying to sort of expand various sorts of policies. You see it, So you see it all over the place, right? This sense that something is wrong with a society that tries to use these bureaucratic mechanisms to solve what are essentially moral problems, right? And so that's I think a central factor in the 60s and 70s. And then some of it is this sort of just the fungibility of this kind of argument, which means it ends up almost everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned the sort of group of folks who come to be called neoconservatives, and they have a really interesting role in a sense. I mean, when I thought about writing the book in terms of chapters by group, that actually would have been one of the hardest chapters as I started researching it, because they're in a sense so committed to scientific authority, to the social sciences. I mean, so many of them come from within those disciplines, either teach them or teach them occasionally or are trained in them. I mean, the main leader who doesn't, Norman Podhoretz, actually virtually never says anything about science, surprisingly. And so it becomes another version of this kind of dissidence within the social science disciplines themselves, in a sense of the misuse of scientific authority and the misuse of modern theories of behavior. So it's a really a kind of fascinating nuance there. But they also contribute some of the most powerful sorts of tropes, right? About this new class, for example. I mean, you see new class rhetoric on the New Left. You see it, versions of it among what become called the paleoconservatives of the 50s. But it's obviously these figures who sort of make the new class analysis front and center. And
for people who don't know, what's the new class?
Yeah, the new class is, roughly synonymous with a kind of professional managerial class, bringing down to earth this critique of scientific authority and suggesting that these are the people who have sort of spread this ideology throughout our society, and these are the people who've done it because they have a professional interest in sort of maintaining themselves as the kind of protectors of all, right? As the kind of instruments of this bureaucratic state, as the educators, as the social scientists, as the various sorts of experts. And so they really bring that front and center into the conversation in a way that's picked up by communitarians and others. I mean, I show side by side, people that we would call a communitarian or a neoconservative. I mean, again, there's a tremendous amount of elision between these positions.
When Ronald Reagan was doing radio slots in the 1970s, he often picked up on this rhetoric.
Yeah,
so,
it's interesting, isn't it?
It's one of those moments. When I like to teach students about the I'm forgetting their journal, public interest.
Public interest, right?
Just because I feel like it's really helpful for kind of seeing how left-right lines get drawn. I mean, I really feel like our contemporary politics get set in this moment in a lot of ways. So
that kind of convergence. Many of these folks still continue to think of themselves as being on the left throughout their lives. The convergence of their kinds of concerns, or folks that we would want to call a communitarian, like a Michael Novak or Christopher Lasch, some of these figures in the 1970s that become celebrities in a sense, right? They bring all of these critiques so profoundly into the mainstream, into the media discourse, into the, obviously into the new think tanks, right? Into all of these new forums, and really define the language that you see, across both parties by the 1990s, certainly in that era of Bill Clinton, right?
Right.
All the assumptions that we're now sort of starting to unpack about the crime bills in that era, and talking about that again with Biden back in office. Right?
Yeah, and the dismantling of the welfare state. I mean, so many things, prison rules and such. So you were working on this book late enough that you were able to get a mention of COVID into the conclusion.
Yes, that's right. And the introduction there.
And the introduction. I was rereading the conclusion today, so that's why I was thinking about it. So, how have you seen this kind of play out over the last year or so?
I think there's a baseline of distrust of scientific experts in the United States that bears the marks of this long tradition of argumentation about scientists having a kind of inhuman view of persons, right? Having a sort of fundamentally skewed and dangerous sense of who we are as human beings. I think you see that behind, if we look at the sources of a kind of post-truth climate, many people will just look, very recently and talk about the Trump administration and talk perhaps about the Christian right. Others will widen the window a little bit and look at maybe the last 50 years and talk about the counterculture and talk about postmodernism for those who dislike it.
Yeah.
But I think all of those movements have been shaped in a way by this deeper tradition of contending that scientists have, bequeathed us this fundamentally inhuman way of thinking about human beings.
Yeah.
I think this, clearly you can see it's, I think, clearest on the political left. You can see a very rapid sort of disillusionment with scientific thinking over the course of the 1960s and 1970s. But if you look at the beginning of the story, and I suggest this early on, as of 1920, there are very, very few people who are just critical of science whole cloth in any of these kinds of sweeping ways. They might dislike Darwinism. They may have, a concern here. But compare that to today, when you get all of these sweeping statements about science, being, that we need to resist it by picking up the humanities, that sort of thing. These are just huge generalizations about what science means at a time when I think we need to be much more specific and precise about what we're talking about. If we have concerns about vaccination, we should talk about vaccination. We shouldn't talk about science or expertise or the Enlightenment or modernity, right? We need to talk about specific things going on, the government telling you what to put in your body, right? That's a very fraught process, and there's a lot to talk about there. But we're not going to really get much of a handle on it by making these huge generalizations.
Yeah. On the Christian right, I remember some of the critiques of Fauci were when he was basically, people were banning church gatherings, that there was a misunderstanding of human nature, that even if there was a risk of those gatherings, that was absolutely essential to our nature as
people
humans.
need to worship.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
It was a
and there are those
wonderful
within the
example of that.
churches pushing back that says, the Bible doesn't tell us we have to worship inside, for example, right?
Right.
But yeah, no, you see that very much. I mean, of course, a huge strand of this whole tradition of argumentation has to do with this sense of a perceived battle between, a fundamentally religious people and a kind of secular state that's keeping them down, right? I mean, that's a very, very strong theme in this tradition of argumentation, and that is, of course, the theme that the Christian right has developed, most systematically and most thoroughly. Although you do see it in other places, but yeah, that's certainly coming out there, and the sense that behind it, still, I think there's this sort of background sense that somehow scientists just really don't understand people, right?
Right.
They insist they do, and somehow they force their views on all of us through means that remain fairly nebulous. Right. And of course, scientists don't think they have any purchase on public culture at all, right? They think nobody listens to them at all. But this just sort of, really kind of habitual sense that this is a scientific culture, of course. So what is the problem with it? And let's start from there and then figure out what is wrong with the way that scientists think and how that ramifies in various particular practical realms. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to talk to you more about this kind of generalities and abstractions. I really love that part of the book and what you've said so far. So, from the conclusion, you write, in our debates, massive abstractions still abound as commentators invoke the usual broad categories: science, scientism, rationalism, the Enlightenment, the humanities, humanism, religion, faith, irrationality, the West, modernity. Yet such large-scale abstractions have proven remarkably unhelpful in the controversies of our day. And I think that's so true. I don't want to get overly nerdy here, but I was thinking about the philosopher Wittgenstein. In some of his notebooks, he talks about the craving for generality that we have. Yeah. And, I just was thinking, this is a big theme of the book, I think, is that when we talk about these things, we tend to talk in these very abstract terms. Yeah, yeah. So, where do you think that? Have you thought about where that comes from and why that's the case?
I think that relates to some extent to the kind of professional location and also the sort of personal psychology of many of the people that are offering these critiques. And this is partly why it's an account that's in some ways anchored on the kind of community of professional intellectuals. Is because I'm interested in the critiques that are offered at this level of generality, in some ways above all, also because they have very loud voices and they've shaped our views in important ways. But I think, those of us who take up the scholarly life are generally inclined to think in these fairly broad terms, right?
Yeah.
And we're generally inclined, as I say in the introduction, to think that all of the stuff around us, right, all of the politics, all of the nitty-gritty of daily life in some ways reflects some kind of philosophical foundation, and that we could kind of get at it all together if we attacked whatever that deep root was. I think this is a tendency that is very, very common among academics, intellectuals of various kinds, is to a kind of philosophical reduction of the entire world to sort of competing systems of thought, which allows us to believe we have greater purchase on them than I believe we do.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I like about your work, going way back, is all the different kind of subfields of history that you pull together. And I think you come in part from a kind of intellectual history background.
Yeah, that's my original training. That's right.
And but yeah, I think you have it, because of the view you just outlined. You have some real questions about how intellectual historians have traditionally thought
absolutely
about.
Yeah, I think they're some of the
ideas.
Worst offenders in some ways of some of the leading proponents of this kind of philosophical reduction. And I, on the other hand, I'm certainly someone who wants to say that ideas and their makers are important in the world, but I think we need to be very clear on how they're important. And they're important insofar as these arguments get picked up and used for a whole bunch of different purposes. Often, perhaps usually, for reasons and for interests that weren't right. I mean, I'm fascinated by misunderstanding, I guess I would say, and that's one of the reasons why these arguments at this level of generality, I think, can be so powerful, is that they can appeal to so many different people for so many different reasons. They become the source of a certain kind of consensus that is very empty, in a sense, in terms of having specific content, or everyone can just start by saying, oh, we live in a scientific culture. Okay, let's start, let's figure out then what to make of that and what that looks like. And people fill it in with all sorts of their own content. I would just straight up reject that. I don't think we live in a scientific culture. But the fact that so many people not even argue it, but just take it for granted is a very powerful fact about our world, because that just wasn't true certainly in the United States as of even 1920, I don't believe. And they may have set a technical culture by then, right? They may have been thinking about electricity and that sort of thing. But even that sort of argument is in some ways a product of the 1920s, right? Earlier self-understandings of, what is American culture had mostly been predicated on either politics, this is a, democratic republic, or on Christianity.
Yeah. Forgive me, I lost my train of thought for a second. There was something I wanted to ask you.
Generalities.
Yeah. Will I get that one back?
It'll come.
Well, let me go to the next question I had for you.
Sure.
And see if it comes back to me. I know they're related. So in your view, I think you've already begun to talk about this with these kind of generalities, but what do you see as the best road forward? I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is that we need, if we're going to talk about vaccines, for instance, was the example used before, we should talk about vaccines, because there's a huge number of deep and important questions there.
Absolutely.
About authority and about science and about certainty and about racism. I mean, there's so many things we can go into there. Yeah. So is the idea that we should focus more on the particular and avoid these kind of massive generalities?
I think that's usually pretty good advice in a lot of different domains. I think I'm extremely wary of the way that language obscures content as well as reveals it. And I think that if we're talking about just about anything and we say the term liberalism, for example, I mean, I actually actively tried not to use that word in my first book, even though all the people in it would be considered liberals more or less. It means so many different things to so many different people that I don't think it's a very useful instrument for actually getting ideas. And so I'm generally always an advocate of trying to take down that level of generality and to try to be a little more precise about what it is that we're talking about. And I think, to me, the core message of decades of scholarship on social construction and the way that social values and interests are intertwined with knowledge making and with technological innovation and that sort of thing is that they tend to be, these processes tend not to sort of be big sweeping generalities. They tend to be very local, very messy, very complex, right? Very multi-sided. And that if we want to talk about vaccination, we need to talk about specific procedures, specific kinds of moments, that, we might want to say, something broad about the fact that this technology or this, medical advance is shaped by values. But then we really need to dig in and see, because, in each case there are different sets of interests, different sets of groupings, literally different categories of people that are affected by that particular innovation or by that particular theory. And I think we need to take those cases on their own terms. And that's, I guess, frustrating as a scholarly agenda, right? That doesn't, give us this great big purchase on large questions. But I think it's really crucial in order to actually have real purchase on them, is to say, well, the climate controversy is different from the vaccination controversy, is different from any number of other things that we could be talking about, right? Obviously, vaccine hesitancy, if 25% of frontline nurses and doctors, or whatever the statistic is, don't want to get the vaccine, that's coming from a very different place than, the QAnon person online, right?
Right. Yeah.
And we need to understand all of those dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, as our role as teachers, I think that's something we can do in the classroom too, is try to bring people down to specifics as often as possible, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I remembered what I wanted to ask you.
Good.
It's kind of like skepticism about, philosophical foundationalism, or however we want to think about that. Where do you think that comes from in you? Is that just part of
me?
The Andy Jewett instinct about the world, or do you think that's something you came to?
I don't know. I mean, I went through that, as I've actually went through many of the positions that I discuss in my book.
Yeah.
I came out of college with many of the commitments that I'm now sort of historicizing, I'd say. Maybe went back into graduate school with many of them as well.
Yeah.
I guess, I don't know. I think that's just probably many years of observing the world. But I think, too, that it has been one of the lessons of scholarship in history, science, STS, the fields I tend to follow, political theory most closely. I have just found a sort of, fairly constant mismatch between the most sweeping generalizations offered in those fields, and not everyone writes like that, and the kinds of questions that I think we need to be addressing in our lives. And I'm very much committed to making my scholarship speak in some way, at least through some sort of translation, to our public concerns. And there's a way in which this level of generality can allow us to sort of play with ideas in a way that's sort of relatively reality-free.
Yeah.
I don't, it's something I'm still trying to figure out, I would say. I don't believe ideas don't matter. I don't believe systematic ideas don't matter. I wouldn't want to say that, but I'm much more likely to say that in conversations with other intellectual historians than I am to say that in conversations with other U.S. historians, right? For whom I think ideas generally matter more than they are given credit for. I think they matter. I guess I would argue ultimately that they matter differently. I think they matter in these much more complex and ambiguous ways, that they get taken up by specific actors in specific contexts, and they get put to specific purposes, and that's where a lot of the really interesting stuff happens.
Yeah, that's great, man. I love that. I don't like to ask people who have brand new books out what they're working on next. But
go for it.
Especially during a pandemic when we're all dealing with childcare and such. But what are you thinking about, man?
Yeah, well, it's been 2 months since the book came out. It's an eternity. And then, of course, months before that when it was really finished. So I'm developing a whole bunch of new research on science and anti-racism, mainly in the U.S., but hopefully with a transnational dimension as well. We have all this great work on how science has been used to uphold racial inequalities. Yeah. And I'm interested in the other side of the story to some extent. I mean, we still need to do a lot more of that work. but I'm really committed to the idea that science has changed the conditions of argumentation for everyone.
Yeah.
As in this book, I'm arguing that scientists aren't the only ones who define public images of science. I also want to see how those who are attacking these structures of discrimination and so forth were mobilizing scientific resources as well.
Yeah.
So where is science in the civil, classic phase of the civil rights movement?
Mm-hmm.
So I have a sort of big project in mind there. The piece I'm pulling out right now is a history of the environmental justice movement as it's coming together, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, and looking at some of the interplay of movement activism and bureaucratic policy formation and some of the work that's being done in the universities and around concepts of justice and how sort of intertwined in the environmental justice movement. Because if you just say the phrase environmental justice, it is so many different things. It's a movement, it's a policy rubric, it's a concept. And so I'm interested in seeing how, and it's a place where many kinds of scientific work, and in fact other kinds of academic work, are also brought into the conversation. There's of course the natural sciences in relation to environmental science in general, but also the social scientists do an enormous an important amount of work by demonstrating the kind of fundamental bias in the siting of polluting facilities and so forth, right? Giving scientific credibility to that very obvious but ultimately anecdotal observation about where these things end up. And then the humanities and political theory as well, right? And the ways in which conversations about justice, this is originally called environmental racism, it's called environmental equity, and then that in a very short amount of time shifts to environmental justice. The name of the EPA office has even changed, right around 1993, right after Clinton, I think, enters office. And so I'm interested in, at that level, in sort of how is environmental justice as a rubric different from some of these other ways of describing the problem? It allows you to talk in a way that, say, environmental racism doesn't always, about intergenerational justice. It allows you to talk about some of these global dynamics. But justice, has some weaknesses as a concept too, in some of the same ways that equity does, and that it has to be filled with specific sorts of content. And so I want to see how those sort of come out on the ground as well.
I look forward to that, man. That sounds like a great project.
Thanks.
Andy, thanks for joining me today.
Absolutely. It's great fun.